Tonight, on History, So It Doesn't Repeat, we feature a research discussion led by Brett Veinotte, digging into the relevant, substantial, and credible evidence of the agenda of the New World Order. We'll discover how to organize and assemble the puzzle, one piece at a time, revealing the big picture and what we can do about it. Learning's the answer. What's the question? It's all coming up on History, So It Doesn't Repeat.
Welcome back to History, So It Doesn't Repeat. I'm your host and navigator, Richard Grove, and today is July 4th, 2013, and we're celebrating the 4th anniversary of Tragedy and Hope's premiere issue back in 2009, as well as memorializing our nation's birth in 1776. Instead of celebrating illusory independence, we've all gotten together tonight to help inspire and create some cognitive liberty. Our conversation is going to be a component which plays into a much bigger episode, that of Brett Veinotte's series, How the Truth Became Illegal. It will center on some very substantial and tangible history, which just might have escaped your attention. As a result of tonight's conversation, you'll be empowered with a comprehensive understanding of how we got here and what we can do to change the world, one mind at a time. Joining me via Skype is Brett Veinotte, host of the School Sucks podcast, and Kevin Cole, co-writer of State of Mind, The Psychology of Control. Together, we'll unfold some history that we're familiar with, and we'll leave you a map, a compass, and a gyroscope so you can find your own way in the world and keep your balance in the process. Gentlemen, let's begin with hearing a summary from Brett on why he created this new series, which, if we do a good job tonight, we might participate in.
Well, thanks for having me. And the title of the series is How the Truth Became Illegal. And I was intrigued by these events in the news recently regarding the NSA and Edward Snowden and how much talk there was in the mainstream media regarding the law and what legal power the government had. And I wanted to look into the history of using law to silence dissent and to, basically interrupt free speech. So I felt like a good place to start was the Espionage Act of 1917, and then there was an additional piece of legislation that went along with the Espionage Act called the Sedition Act in 1918. So almost immediately, as pieces of legislation like this, usually is the way, it is used for things which it was not intended to be used for. And, what I realized as I continued to, jog my memory about what I knew about this period of time, which was the first Red Scare, roughly from 1918 to 1921. And then the second episode dealt with the second Red Scare from 1947 to the mid-1950s. In both post-war periods in America, there seems to be this real hypervigilance and paranoia. And during the first Red Scare, it is about communism because of the Russian Revolution that was taking place starting in 1917. And it's also about a bunch of other things. Like, it seems like people understood that something was changing, that some kind of subversion was taking place, but they lacked the vocabulary and they lacked the historical context to really be able to put their finger on it. So they could see the shadow of an enemy, but they couldn't see its face. And they just, through public discussion and politics and legislation, imagined the face to be alcohol. So we have prohibition or communism or homosexuality or black people. And then really in the second Red Scare, it was pretty much exclusively communism. But what I really discovered was that people were responding to essentially an internationalist, collectivist subversion of America, but they just didn't know how to explain that to themselves and to each other. So what you get is this mass hysteria and paranoia. And if I can just offer up a little appetizer of what we're going to talk about today. During the second Red Scare, everybody, even, right down to your average public high school history classroom, very, very familiar with McCarthyism. And, the investigation into communist subversion in the United States first started in the House of Representatives with HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, where they go after Hollywood and other opinion shapers. And then around 1950 and into the 50s, it shifts to Joseph McCarthy in the Senate and his investigations into communist subversion in government. Well, drowned out by all this noise of McCarthyism, there's another congressional investigation going on at the same time in the background. It's called the Select Committee to Investigate Tax-Exempt Foundations and Comparable Organizations. And here, a group of congressmen are concerned about the influence of these tax-exempt foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation. And initially, the committee is headed by a guy named Eugene Cox, and he's a Democrat. There is, a minority committee headed by a guy named Carol Reese. And initially, they look at what these tax-exempt foundations are doing. They kind of give it a thumbs up and hope to shut the books on all that. And then Carol Reese, who's in the minority party in the committee, asked the investigation to be reopened. And his chief investigator, a guy named Norman Dodd, starts looking into these foundations a little bit more closely. And they're very upfront with what they're doing. And Dodd eventually explained in an interview with G. Edward Griffin, I think in 1981, that the foundations were using money and influence to prevent, I think he refers to it as a reversion to a pre-war mindset. In other words, going back to, having freedom and individualism as an ideal and not living in fear. So part of the role of the foundations, which they admitted to Dodd in this investigation, was to move America into this new age and this new order. But nobody knows about the Reese Commission or Norman Dodd because of all of the panic that's going on in mainstream history in front of that through McCarthyism. So that's a little preview of what I think we're going to get into.
Well, that's quite a preview, and I greatly enjoyed listening and re-listening to your new series. And through this new series, I'm pretty well versed on most of the history, as is Kevin, but I'm sure we'll both attest throughout this conversation that even when you think you're familiar with these topics, it allows you, that familiarity allows you to learn and listen to new things that you didn't get to hear the first couple times around. And so as you start to integrate this in, you can clearly see, especially with the additional contextual history we'll add tonight, that corporations in America, like the American International Corporation, helped to fund the Bolshevik Revolution. It helped to fund those tax-free foundations. It's connected into the Federal Reserve. So there's some very legitimate and substantial history that we're going to discuss tonight. But right now, I'm really curious, after that intro that you've just laid out, what Kevin's next comment's going to be, because I know that he is just, he's overflowing with facts and references on this specific topic. So I'm really excited to get the mix in. Kevin, I'm going to leave it to you. Where would you like to pick off from where would you like to pick up from where Brett left off?
These commissions that Brett's talking about are key to understanding some of the motivational roles and where the money hides. There's the Reese Committee, the Cox Committee, and then a lesser known called the Poohole Committee that actually deals with some of the actual tax-exempt foundations themselves, going after Rockefeller and Standard Oil. And this is referenced in the letter to R. Gordon Wasson, discussing from the St. Louis Federal Reserve document, where R. Gordon Wasson is talked about as being the individual who was the go-to on the Poohole Committee to try to represent these organizations. So they were trying to hide their money and what their influence was. It's interesting because Norman Dodd actually says himself that he had investigators going into the Carnegie Foundation documents and found documents that say exactly that they wanted to revert the United States into a communistic Soviet Union style of government. Now, I'm sure this is widespread across the board, but there are also competing ideologies. There are Fabians who are Fabian socialists, and there are those that are using Fabian strategies for federalist agendas.
Brett, we've got this outline of yours here. Do you want to lead us through the outline?
Yeah, sure. I think that there was a lot of cliffhangers in the two episodes that I did so far. And it basically, traced the history of not this conspiracy that we're going to talk about today, but like I said in the introduction, what was going on out in front of that. So there are I started the whole series with this clip from MSNBC of, who was it? Glenn Greenwald, how could I forget, in kind of a heated exchange over the NSA Snowden thing with Richard Haass, who for the last 10 years has been the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. So I thought that really set the stage for where this series of shows was going to go in truth versus power. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself, and because I've really been immersed in this stuff for like the last 48 hours, and it was a big G. Edward Griffin day for me yesterday, and it was so exciting, and it was almost like this emotional experience of just, how much I can benefit in just a couple of days from 40 years of this guy's research. And, maybe you guys have had a similar experience where, you're sitting, here's an analogy anyway, you're sitting at a table with like a bunch of puzzle pieces, like a mound of puzzle pieces, and some are connected and some aren't. And somebody comes and bangs the table and the puzzle falls into place. I really feel like Griffin's work has that effect where, this is a vast story and that can be pursued from a multitude of different angles, and it can quickly become overwhelming when you look at the ideological origins and the role of central banking or international bankers. So to try and simplify, I think that the best place to start in this discussion would be ideological origins of the conspiracy itself. But I was hoping that you guys would first provide some insight into the importance of this book, Tragedy and Hope, by Carol Quigley. And without getting, too much into what the book reveals or what the book is about, why is this book so important to historians like yourselves?
Well, I'll take that question, it being the obvious question for me to answer. I went through public schooling. And so going through public schooling and not being exposed to the legitimate, real history of how the world works, I found to be disappointing. I found it even more disappointing to find out that I had attended a respectable university for 5 years that never made me aware that such a book or such a perspective on how the world works exists, let alone the fact that it had serious credibility. So I wandered through corporate world for many years until I bumped up against reality. There's a great George Orwell quote where he says, usually you can maintain your illusion until you bump up against reality, usually on a battlefield. And so, bumping up against reality, then you go and search and say, what's the credible information that's out there that someone else has encountered this before and is left behind so I can learn from it. And luckily, the book that really helped me put things together wasn't so much a book like None Dare Call It Conspiracy. Like I was aware of these type of conspiratorial books, but they always lacked the substantial references and interconnectivity to tell a bigger picture without dumbing it down and making it cartoonish. And so when I found out about the story of Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley and it being published in 1966 by Macmillan, having its plates destroyed so that it could cease circulation, and there must have been an important message in there. They rebranded the book as The World Since 1939, a history, which only gave you the last half of Tragedy and Hope. And so there became bootleg copies out there, but some of the bootleg copies and republished copies didn't even contain the unabridged version of Tragedy and Hope. It claimed to be the whole version, and then we had to do a study, as we mentioned with the Ultimate History Lesson with John Taylor Gatto, where we went and compared the multiple versions of Tragedy and Hope to find out what has been censored or excised out. Those pages happen to be 61 through 63, so it's really pages 62 and 63. And we can talk about what those pages mean and why they would have to be censored or why they would take away the first half of this book, because the last half of the book didn't really make much sense without the first half. And so it's this treasure trove of legitimate, substantial, verifiable, respectable history that rarely anyone ever brought up. So I thought, this is something that it needs to be on the tip of everyone's tongue, and people need to be talking about the contents of this book, because it really does help you. It helps your mind organize the copious amount of content so that you can get a clear and accurate picture of the artifacts and evidence that have been left behind as our legacy here as humans on this planet. So it's about learning where you came from so we can find out where we're going. And The Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time is the full name of the textbook. It's not the only book by Quigley that's valuable. He wrote The Evolution of Civilizations and The Anglo-American Establishment. And if you read those 3 books together, you can get a picture of history over the long term. That's like the macrocosm. But he'll also give you the microcosm of power in the 20th and 21st century, because what's going on today is very much a legacy of Cecil John Rhodes, which is a heavy talking point within Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley.
Kevin, anything to add?
Yeah, I think he covered much of it. Carroll Quigley was an interesting individual in that he went to both Harvard and Princeton. There was an article written about him in the 1970s by a Washington Post reporter that I've been analyzing called The Professor Who Knew Too Much. And what it sought to do was kind of set forth the right-left dichotomy that kind of accompanied this book throughout history, where you have groups that are so-called ultra-right-wing that are attacking this because it's communistic or because it's socialistic. And he even speaks to some of this in an interview he conducted with Rudy Maxa from the Washington Post. Now, the book's significance escaped me my whole life. I didn't come across this in school, like Rich said. This is not something that they teach everybody on a general level. And in some ways, it's something that I don't think Quigley even realized that he had, because he had become so institutionalized within this environment. I mean, he admits that his tutor was an individual by the name of Crane Brenton, who was an OSS officer and station chief. So he's very much inculcated into this establishment politics from the get-go. So when other people are saying, hey, you're exposing a conspiracy, he's saying, well, this is just how it's the way it works. You know, and whether or not other individuals use that against him and put him juxtaposed to J.P. Morgan and others as a culprit himself, that's something we can discuss also.
And I'm right to say that the Quigley take on what's going on in the 20th century, it's not like he is some great whistleblower shining light into dark places. He's saying, why aren't we telling people about this? This is great. Look how organized you guys are. Why are you keeping this a secret? That kind of speaks to what you were saying, Kevin, about his insulation, right? In intelligentsia and academia. It's like, yeah, this is what we do, right? What people would have a problem with this out there. And it really tells the story of this plan that went into action late 1800s, last couple decades of the 1800s. And it started with a small group of men, but eventually gained what I would describe as an ideological momentum of its own, with lots of carrots for lots of different interests as it continued and as it grew. And you also mentioned None Dare Call It a Conspiracy, written in 1971 by Gary Allen, which is a useful book to get a basic understanding of what Quigley presents in Tragedy and Hope. Obviously doesn't go into nearly as much detail, doesn't name, it names a lot of the same names, but without, the massive detail that Tragedy and Hope offers. And I think that, Rich, you said the word cartoon, kind of does this cartoon presentation that I think it's important to understand, in the significance of Tragedy and Hope, is that these are not cartoon bad guys. They're not James Bond villains. These are people who, maybe didn't even have any recognition of evil intent. And I think when you tell this story to people too quickly, or you make it sound as if there's a real malevolence, like these people aren't even telling themselves a story about how they're doing the right thing, that's the hardest thing for the average person, the average man on the street out there, to believe, that other people would operate with such evil intentions. And I think that's where you lose a lot of people. So as you learn more about the intentions of Rhodes and Milner and all these people that we're going to get into today, there are people who are shaping this ideology that don't really have evil intentions. There are people who will, attach themselves to it as it goes on. I think Griffin said one time that government is a magnet for the predatory class.
Secret society, people think, they don't exist anymore, do they? Well, they do, and Quigley wrote about them. And he said that he had no aversion to this secret society. In fact, he said he had been invited into its inner ranks. He was never a member of the elite himself, but he was brought in as their historian, you might say, to record their events and to put it in the public record so that they could have a permanent record for all time. And he said he was invited into the group, and he was able to examine their private records. And then he said, I have no aversion to it or its goals or its policies. He said, the only thing I disagree with is that they hope to remain secret. Most wars in modern history are fought for the enhancement of power and wealth on the part of the elites that run those governments. They want to expand their influence. They want greater dominance. Maybe they want the natural resources. In other words, they're not for reasons that we have been told. It's a fact of life. And there's no clearer example of that, I believe, than in World War I and, of course, in World War II. But the question around was World War I. The American people at that time were very complacent about the war going on in Europe. It was sort of a war between, Germany and France and England. Okay, I'm sorry about that, but leave us out of it. We declared our neutrality and everything, and we just said, we hope you guys work it out real soon, which is the way we're supposed to be, There was no particular national interest on our part to be involved in that war. We weren't that threat. And besides, according to our Constitution, the only purpose of our government was to protect us to protect our lives, our liberty, and our property. If it didn't touch in those areas, we're out of it because the Constitution forbids that power to the government. Anyway, that's how the American scene was at that time. And people in finance and in government really had a different point of view because, you see, J.P. Morgan at that time was the bond broker for the British bonds. The British government was trying to raise money. In addition to taxes, they were borrowing it through bonds, so they were issuing bonds. And J.P. Morgan was given the franchise to sell those bonds in America, and he sold a lot of them.
Secure your copy today at Infowars.com.
So once you have this ideological corruption and you have accepted this idea that control over a group or control over a nation or control over a planet is okay and the way forward, yes, there will be people who latch onto that and use it for their own gains. But I think that maybe we could try to flesh out a little bit better the ideological origins of what is often called this Rhodes group or this Rhodes conspiracy that began in the late 1800s.
Well, that's excellent because Rhodes would be like a specific, particular microcosm of the larger idea of collectivism and taking away the rights of individuals, which goes all the way back into Plato's Republic and the seeking of, building a caste system to classify certain individuals into certain lifestyles that will be the best for the people that run those things. So what you see through history is the only war that's ever gone on is the battle of consciousness. It's waged by those who want to suppress consciousness. It's waged against those who want to express consciousness. You see this in many forms throughout history, but what you see is a history of social control, a history of using other human beings as slaves. And once upon a time in history, not so long ago, on July 4th, 1776, some people used some words to separate themselves from tyranny, and that's how America was founded. So you see these continual struggling stories through history, and every now and then you see a bright spot where people resist effectively, but then they kind of, forget about that. They get lazy, they get dumbed down, they get reintroduced to the empire, and they forgot that they were ever supposed to be apart from the empire. So this idea of Cecil Rhodes and his last will and testament, it's a specific agenda for the 20th and 21st century to take away nationhood, to create a one world government. And it's a plan, it's a collectivist plan based on plundering other people's production. So there's a lot of people of various races, nationalities, religions, and creeds who subscribe to a collectivist idea where they wait for you to produce something whereby they can come by and plunder. This is organized crime or the mafia on a very small scale, but what most people don't recognize is on a large scale, it's called government. And the reason that people don't recognize this is because we spend 15,000 hours in a public schooling session where their whole deal is to convince us that they're not the mafia. You know, they have really good PR called public education, and the government can tax people using force, fraud, and coercion, and they can do all these sorts of things that are ubiquitous to us because we're just brought up into a culture where that's how it works, death and taxes, this sort of thing, right? But when you actually break it down and try to know yourself and try to understand these institutions that surround you, that you participate in wittingly or unwittingly, you find that knowledge is power, and that they use a knowledge gap or a power gap or a wealth gap. It's the withholding of useful information from individuals that gives them power. Cecil Rhodes' specific plan is based around that, but also the longer strategy through history, starting with Plato's Republic, let's say, and culminating in the late 19th century in Fabian socialism. These are all just, people improving on the methods of harnessing human resources and herding people like cattle.
So we do see, starting in around 1890, a plan go into action that continues right up to the present day, right? Like some of these other things, there might be separations, right, where it's not continual all throughout history, even though I take your point that it is, a new group of people looking at what had been done in the past and saying, okay, how can we improve upon that? So initially, it's this Oxford professor, John Ruskin, who Cecil Rhodes is one of his students. And I think we're in the 1870s at this point. And, talk about, the road to hell being paved with good intentions. He says that to his students at Oxford, we have a moral obligation to disseminate English culture. Basically, look at how great we are. Look at this magnificent tradition in art, in education, in literature. Griffin paraphrased Rhodes in one of his talks, saying, we owe it to the world to disseminate this culture to everybody. Now, even though today we don't see a conspiracy to bring the world under British control as it once was the goal of the British Empire, around the colonial America and India and all these other places, pretty much all over the world for the last 500 years. But we still do have this template that Rhodes developed, and that is still moving forward. So you mentioned Fabianism as well, which I understand is separate, but do either you or Kevin want to speak to Fabianism and how that might play into this story?
Sure. If I can touch on some of your earlier points first. When you're talking about with Cecil Rhodes in his last will and testament, you are talking about a class of people during his lifetime that were very much hurt about the United States being lost in the earlier war. And Cecil Rhodes himself says that if it wasn't for the stupidity or laziness of King George III, that they would have been holding Parliament in London and New York every other year. And so there is this in his multiple wills and testaments, starting in 1877 and onward, there is this drive to perpetuate Anglo-Saxon unity. And from the 1877 will, it says to perfect a system of immigration from the United Kingdom to the colonies to further the consolidation of the British Empire, to assist towards the restoration of Anglo-Saxon unity, towards securing the representation of the colonies in Parliament and the foundation of power so great as to render wars impossible and promote the best interests of humanity. And then later, this idea becomes the Rhodes Scholarship. So when you're looking at perfecting a system of immigration, you got to start to look at the settlement movement that started in the late 1800s, around the same period of time that you're discussing. And Cecil Rhodes had a good friend by the name of Arnold Toynbee, who was an economic historian, also a closer friend of Lord Alfred Milner, who dies at a young age. And then they donate they name this building Toynbee Hall, which inaugurates the settlement movement, where they start moving poor people into rich areas and rich people into poor areas, and experimenting with different social designs. Now, this starts in the late 1800s. Toynbee Hall is 1884. Now, what's fascinating is that the Fabian Society is founded in 1884 as well. You have the Fellowship of the New Life founded in 1883, which is by Thomas Davidson. Thomas Davidson was a Scottish English immigrant into the United States who founded what's called the Fellowship of the New Life. Now, before he did that, he was an educator and created his own college called Breadwinners College, where they would bring the immigrants through the settlement houses and they would bring them to the schools that they brought up themselves, that they created. Now, where Carroll Quigley gets most of his information from Tragedy and Hope is from a guy by the name of Alfred Zimmerman in 1947. And he says in this audio with Rudy Maxa that I mentioned that Alfred Zimmerman got his way into the Rhodes Roundtable Secret Society by teaching at the Educational Alliance. The Educational Alliance is a branch of the settlement movement that began in England with Toynbee Hall and all of these guys trying to perfect this system of immigration earlier in the 1800s before he even dies. So there is that influence of John Ruskin, who was a member of the Psychic Research Councils with T.H. Green. He was also involved with the Aristotelian societies, which had a lot of trans-American and transnational interest. In fact, William Torrey Harris, who is probably the single most important person in the importation of Prussian education in the United States, aside from Bronson Alcott, is actually the one, as the Commissioner of Education, who approves the Rhodes Scholarships coming into the United States. Now, keeping with the 1800s, you have this group called the St. Louis Philosophical Society, which is William Torrey Harris and Henry Conrad Bruckmeyer. Now, Bruckmeyer is a Prussian soldier who left after the revolutions of 1848 and came over to the United States. And they came over here because there was an influence going back to the New Harmony colony in Indiana, where Albion, Illinois, which was a colony of the English of England in the United States in Illinois territory before Illinois became a state. They created what was called Albion, Illinois. Robert and George Flower, as well as Morris Birkbeck. And Morris Birkbeck wrote many books on the history of traveling, on his travels from overseas through Virginia to Illinois. And these books became immensely popular in Jena around the same time after the addresses from the German nation by Johann Fichte. So you have this continuity where Johann Fichte, who is responsible for taking Pestalozzi's ideas, who the Fabian Society idolizes, mind you, and making the Prussian education model, his son goes on to be an honorary member in the St. Louis Philosophical Society. So Thomas Davidson and the founders of the Fabians are very much involved in the Prussian education that you hear about from John Taylor Gatto. Now, other people that influenced Cecil John Rhodes would be a guy by the name of J.R. Seeley. And in the earlier wills of Cecil Rhodes, he states that he wants to make Mr. Seeley the honorary academic for a college that he would create in his name. And this would be the head of this secret society. Now, he goes on to die and doesn't take on this role, but you look into his history, and he writes what's called the Life of Stein, which is an expose on Prussian nationalism, applying it to Anglo-Saxon unity. So I hope that's not too much around the block. I can go a little bit more into detail on some of that, but I'm trying to show that this is, kind of a large circle of transnational continuity, and there are people that still continue it to this day, but it changes over time.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we need you to go back around the block or in more detail right now. What I'm going to do is zoom back out for the audience, because I think some people got motion sickness. There's so much history. Like, you could do a whole college, PhD thesis on what Kevin just laid out right there. But I'm just going to go through some of these notes to help, connect it back to what Brett's teaching his audience. And to the School Sucks podcast audience, I would first say, I'm a listener to the podcast, been a listener for a long time. I love Brett's work. And if you like what you're hearing thus far, we have a whole bunch of work that supports what's being said. So we're not painting or drawing epistemological cartoons. We're pointing to a real financial central banking empire called the Rothschild family, who funded Cecil Rhodes. This is page 52 in Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. We're talking about this ominous continuity that they have a moral obligation, and this is what Gatto calls justified sinning in the Ultimate History Lesson. So this moral obligation allows them to try to gain world control. It's not about British Empire controlling the world. They're just using the British Empire as a vehicle to get world control, and then they control the world everywhere. They're going to be multinational. They're internationalists. That's why they refer to us as isolationists. So this idea of Anglo-Saxon unity was the seed, and that seed grew up into the Pilgrim Society and the CFR and the American International Corporation, where they funded the Cold War, where they funded communism, where they started China and funded Mao. And David Rockefeller said Mao did a great job. These are all real parts of history that if you understood it, then you'd be like, wow, who are we competing against? Why do we have such a big military and defense budget if we really don't have real enemies? We can get into that later, but continuing on, one of the neglected aspects that I've heard thus far is the British East India Company and its role in the British Empire and opium trading. I did hear Brett mention it in an earlier episode in a series about Skull and Bones. That's really the connection with the Russell and Whitney families, is the opium smuggling in the British East India Company. But moving on, Fabianism and eugenics have a very close tie, especially in people like George Bernard Shaw. So when you get into these ideas, it's not just Cecil Rhodes. He just codifies it and gives these people a purpose and a plan and an agenda. All of these ideas of eugenics, that's back in Plato's Republic. So all these ideas are not new, but they've harnessed technology and they've gotten maybe greedier as they've gone on. We can talk about De Beers and Cecil Rhodes and blood diamonds and how they fund the whole empire with diamonds are forever. But I'm just staying on track with the notes here. Kevin also mentioned Jena. This is the infamous battle where the Prussian people lost to Napoleon's amateur army at this battle, which inspired the Prussian education system, which we're trying to escape right now. And that left us with J.R. Seeley. We'll leave J.R. Seeley in the brain model here, and if you want to check him out further, you can. But now we're synchronized back where we started, Brett. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I would be interested in discussing a little bit further is there an organizational structure to what Rhodes and Milner initially set up, and how would you describe that? Or what are the parts? What are the pieces? How is it hidden? Is it hidden at all? Or is it all out in the open the whole time?
I'm going to start that out because I think I have the shortest answer. It is out in the open for those of you who care to read about it. The book I would recommend is The History of the Rhodes Trust by Sir Anthony Kenny. He's a knight of the British Empire. And in the back of that book, if you look up through the index, he'll tell you that the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes, he left his amenities and his legacy to the Rothschild family who had funded him in the first place to go down there. So basically, he's a worker bee that went out and did a bunch of stuff, then left it back. They control it through All Souls College at Oxford. This is described by Carroll Quigley in his book, The Anglo-American Establishment, and it's also in the brain model. So when you follow these Rhodes scholars back, there's the Rhodes Trust at Oxford, but there's also the Rhodes Roundtable Group. And to get into All Souls College, Oxford, you have to be a graduate of Oxford and invited. It's not just like any of the other colleges at Oxford.
Kevin, anything to add to that?
No, I think that was good.
Okay, so my understanding was that initially the Rhodes-Milner group is what seems to play out again and again as this moves into the 20th century is that there's always this closed inner circle to these groups, and then there's an outer circle, a more public face to it. So.
Well, this is something that Griffin describes as the rings within rings theory. He attributes it to the Bavarian Illuminati, and Kevin can comment to that because he's done the most research into their original papers and evidence. But what I would notice is, yes, what they do is you have a small circle of people who know that they're getting one over on everyone else, but then they recruit kind of lackeys. These are the types of people that you would see in the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Group, Bilderberg, these types of working groups, because they're not in the central circle. So when Warren Beatty or Angelina Jolie's in the CFR, or Harrison Ford's advertising and shilling for them, I don't think they've taken the time to read Tragedy and Hope or familiarize themselves with Cecil Rhodes' Last Will and Testament. That stuff's not even really on their radar because you're talking about people who don't do their own thinking in the first place, who pretend they're other people for their livelihood, right? So they're not trying to figure out what it means to be a human being and how are we being harnessed and our families and generations are just being wasted because these other people have figured some things out, kept a few key secrets, and that forces the rest of us to kind of just fall in line and be part of this collective. That's what they would like. But I think the American spirit is still kindling, and the things that made America great, self-reliance, self-confidence, self-esteem, that come from knowing yourself and your environment, from having an understanding, from doing the homework, these things can be revitalized. We can make them cool again. We're making them pretty cool right now if you're watching along. So these ideas that made America great came in a stark juxtaposition to the longer term memory of the British Empire. And they're like, oh, we lost a battle with America. Wait a couple years, they'll forget about it. They're an empire. The empire never forgets. So what we've done in America is we've been anesthetized through the public schooling education, as the School Sucks podcast has informed you over the past 228 episodes. There's an ominous continuity to the Prussian schooling being brought into America, people being dumbed down, becoming stimulus response automatons, and forgoing themselves, giving up their soul and outsourcing their thinking instead of doing what they know is right, which is to turn off the TV, open some books that tell you the truth, know how to find fact from fiction in the first place. Maybe go through a couple of our podcasts to find that out. But the idea is to empower yourselves with the information, the organization that we've offered out to people through the media, and the rhetoric that people need to express is themselves. Be the change that you want to see in the world as a result of trying to grasp onto some of the words that we're throwing around tonight.
Kevin, anything?
Yeah, and I sure. As far as you mentioned G. Edward Griffin, and as Rich alluded to, he does mention the rings within rings as coming from the Illuminati. Now, from the research that I have done, and also from Carol Quigley's own mouth, he says that a lot of people are guilty of believing that the same secret society has a organizational continuity all the way going back to Bavaria. And there are those in the John Birch Society, not maybe necessarily as an organization as a whole, but individuals within that who have lumped together the Bavarian Illuminati with the Council on Foreign Relations. Like Myron Fagan, he released several records called The Illuminati, Volume 1, and it has the CFR and the crosshairs with the words Illuminati on it. And that causes a lot of confusion. So when you start to delineate where these organizational structures can continue. Yeah, I do think there's an ideational continuance in, as Rich said, creating a small circle of individuals and then limiting what is being said and then getting access to power and authority. And that's one way that they can continue this over time.
And if I can just jump in there for a second, when I was trying to understand Rhodes as a human being, right, and not as, again, a cartoon villain, and looking at his influences, well, John Ruskin, the Oxford professor, is very understandable. We owe it to the world. That sounds great. There was another book that I read about called The Martyrdom of Man by Wyndham Reed, which is supposedly the author who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. And, explaining or speaking to maybe a rationalization for some of the extents they would have to go to carry out this noble plan for the globe. And another influence of Rhodes was Freemasonry. And so this is I thought of this when you talk about everything getting mixed together as this grand, all-encompassing conspiracy, and it's really not that simple. My understanding is that Rhodes admired the structure of Freemasonry and how, there was a public face and there was an inner core. And he said, I like this secrecy. I think we can do better, essentially. So those are what I see as his influences. And if there's anything to add to that, let me know.
I think we could add a whole week to that, man. So first off, Rhodes's Freemasonic relationship had many ties. One of his favorite brothers was Rudyard Kipling. So there is, a popular writer that we have children's books that we, give to our kids in America that has Freemasonic roots tied directly to Cecil Rhodes. Kevin can go deeper into that. But I wanted to mention, first off, anytime we're bringing up G. Edward Griffin and Creature from Jekyll Island, the primary reference that I would get and read if I were you on the Federal Reserve and its history is The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, the original book written on it. Eustace Mullins worked in the Library of Congress. He went through 4,500 volumes of congressional testimony to amalgamate that book. I found it to be highly useful and credible over the years when you do your research and check into these things. On the screen behind me, Cecil Rhodes here is sitting with Lord Alfred Bate. I want Kevin to comment on Lord Alfred Bate here in a minute as well. But going back through, Rhodes also had a lot of support, like I said, from the Rothschild family, and it's through the Balfour Declaration and Lord Rothschild's participation in that they're bringing the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes into the state of Israel many years later. And so when you find this ominous continuity thread, what you find is in 1861, a writer named Moses Hess wrote about how they were taking over Freemasonry, how they were going to recreate Zion in Palestine. So they were going to take this land away, and they were going to use Rothschild and Cecil Rhodes are named specifically in this 1861 book, right? So you see this continuity of Freemasonry, rebuilding Zion, which is a Freemasonic idea, and the taking of someone else's land to create this, and that they had a plan going on since the 1800s. And then you look at it and say, well, didn't Herzl know about Moses Hess? And the answer is no. Theodor Herzl, who popularized Zionism in popular culture, later found out that, when he's writing to Cecil Rhodes and saying, hey, I've got this plan to make Israel, Cecil Rhodes doesn't bother to really tell him, hey, this is a 1861 plan that you're unwittingly participating in. And when Herzl kind of finds that out, he's kind of outcast. And the other important thing is that, Herzl planned his plan for Israel on Rhodes's last will and testament. Rhodes's last will and testament is structured on the quote-unquote Constitution of the Jesuits. Now, Constitution, that word, can have many different names. It doesn't mean a piece of paper with writing on it, because people will say, well, the Jesuits don't have constitutions. Look at the multiple meanings of that word, and he's basically saying the essential structure that what makes a Jesuits a great secret society through time, they wanted to take and replace the words Roman Catholic, Church with British Empire. And so in the last will and testament of Cecil John Rhodes, he's telling you it's basically do a word replacement. These guys have a good plan going, but we have more resources over here, or they have more resources over there, and they could, take it to their advantage. Go ahead, Kev.
Yeah, where do I start? That could go on forever. The great points. With Cecil Rhodes and the idea of using the Jesuit strategy, that really brings forth the principle of organic unity and how they use education to create a closed circle in order to affect change within that circle. This is something that I think does bear a significance, but it does not mean a temporal direct continuity from the Bavarian Illuminati all the way down to the CFR and to these other organizations. It really is the idea of secrecy and creating rings within rings as a strategy to manipulate issues and to insulate people from different oppressors or different prying eyes at the time. With the Bavarian Illuminati, they were fighting against the divine right of kings, but they were also trying to take away a state and create a kind of libertarian communistic attitude. But that was blasphemy to be running around saying that at the time. They had to create reading societies in order to even discuss these ideas amongst their adepts. And you can learn a lot about that from Jiva Singh and Anand's book, as well as Terry Mullinson's book on the Bavarian Illuminati. But there is a definite attempt by the group that was trying to institute the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes, as well as their own ideas, to manipulate education in a way to take away what is being taught in American history, so you create a new body politic in the future. So, it's kind of that principle of, if I can control the children, I don't care about the adults, because I've got the future. And so you can look into where, when William T. Stead comes on. I noticed you had the 1877 will mentioned. I believe that's changed in 1879 or 89 perhaps, when William T. Stead gets involved. And that's where you get the idea for the Rhodes Scholarship. He writes this to a picked 500,000, which is a speech to the future Rhodes Scholarships of the world, who would basically be a new Mandarin class that would sit atop the Prussian education structure.
And what Kevin's mentioning about organic unity really ties back to ancient Greece, and this is where it comes back full circle with the School Sucks podcast, is it's this idea of enkycleos paideia. It's the education in a circle. It's like being a dog chained to a doghouse, and you only have a certain circumference of the world that you are able to know. And it's this idea of enkycleos paideia that has its legacy today of organic unity, trying to create a bunch of citizenry who all know and speak and parrot the same things and have the same perspectives. And it's also this idea of enkycleos paideia that leads to the word encyclopedia. And this is something that we've talked all about enkycleos paideia in the first episode of History So It Doesn't Repeat, which is Kevin Cole doing a briefing on the trivium method versus the classical trivium. And I believe it was in that episode where we talked about enkycleos paideia last time.
That's correct. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Kevin, what was that you mentioned about the new Mandarins, and how does that fit into this?
Well, in Prussian culture, which has been emulated by the Anglo-Saxon design, the new Mandarin is really a throwback to the bureaucratic overclass that ruled China for over 1,000 years. Now, Prussia had this, And this kind of new Mandarin verbiage is even used to describe the Rhodes Scholars. You can find many articles leading up to the election of President William Jefferson Clinton, because he brought in, I think, the second most Rhodes Scholars into any presidency after JFK. And so it goes to this concept of Anglo-Saxon Prussianism. And a little background on that would be, I have a book by Norman Anglo called America in the New World State that was written in the early 1900s. This particular copy is actually the personal copy of Major H.E. Atterbury, who was a member of the Creel Commission with Edward Bernays that led to the United States getting involved in World War I. And this is dated 1915, Paris, May 1915, of H.E. Atterbury. It's called America in the New World State. And it has a chapter in here called Anglo-Saxon Prussianism. And what it's referring to, and Norman Anglo is one of the founders of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and what it's referring to is the period around the colonization and institution of apartheid in South Africa by Cecil Rhodes and his cohorts. So, and also the same period of time where the United States was invading the Philippines and involved in the Spanish-American War. So you have financial situations on both sides going back and forth, supplying loans to each other in this transnational unity, trying to usurp a national sovereignty of the United States. And really, they even say that. In Quigley's Anglo-American Establishment, he states that in 1911, the All Souls Fellows, those that were the head of the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Round Table Group, following the organic unity of Cecil Rhodes' Last Will and Testament, and in many cases actually being the administrator of those trusts, they said just as much. They used a book by F.S. Oliver on Alexander Hamilton, and they used that as a way to undo the American Revolution. And that's in Quigley's own words. I also found that Alfred Zimmerman, who coined the phrase welfare state, and also helped Lionel Curtis change the British Empire over to Commonwealth, he was responsible for writing a book called The American Commonwealth, which they also used, and it was comparing the United States to the Republic. And so from my point of view, it seems like they're trying to activate Plato's Republic within the United States, which if you look into the Builders of Empire book by Jessica Harlan Jacobs, you'll find that around this exact same period of time, Freemasonry worldwide was a tool of British Empire.
And I think that's important to remember, because what you have are these ideas that were espoused by Plato, picked up through secret societies, carried through time, and they just happen to be, coincidentally, some of the same goals of worldwide Freemasonry that the British Empire was heavily leveraging. That's how they were integrating themselves into these colonies and getting colonized in the first place, was the organizational structure, global organizational structure provided through Freemasonry. So before we get into the CFR and its predecessor, the Pilgrim Society, or something that came after the CFR, like the Union Now Project, these are all Anglo-American establishment working groups, agendas to bring the United States out of its sovereign state, back under the British Empire, and the participation of America in, for instance, the Spanish-American War. That's where you really start to see what they called yellow journalism, the use of propaganda on the public, and no longer America being, like Thomas Jefferson said, never needing to fight a war because we've got these great boundaries of oceans. We got called isolationist. America, who wanted to stay out of these things, was isolationist, and we got talked into participating in World War I. There were a couple lies told. It all ties back into Balfour and Lord Rothschild and what was going on in Britain at the time. But, when you look into how America got involved in these foreign wars, where a large percentage of people in America from that time were German speaking, there was a lot of immigrants in this country. So what you look at as far as history is a book like Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan. Now, she's the great-great-granddaughter of Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain from World War II. So she's using the personal letters archives of Balfour and all these characters that she's painting out. And what she paints out as the official establishment history is far different than what we were taught in American schools. And so it just shows that what we've been taught in American schools has been so far removed from even the history that the British Empire teaches its own people. It's noteworthy. So there's this ominous continuity once again between America's participation in collectivist activities, putting bases all around the world. It's not America's idea to do these bases. That's America under British influence, being the front end, the tip of the spear on their empire building. And that's why they also have such a close relationship, the British Empire, with Israel, because they're part and parcel. America, Israel, and Great Britain, there are no lines between those intelligence agencies, right? And so when you have Kim Philby or Alger Hiss or any of these people that were called spies, those people were working at a higher level. They were working on both sides. They're connected in at, for instance, the Round Table level, because as Quigley notes, and he was Clinton's teacher at Georgetown, Quigley notes that oftentimes the Round Table group works with the communists and capitalists, that they don't have an aversion to this. And Quigley's only aversion was he thought its role in history was so significant that it should be known. In other words, he thought that they were so far ahead in the race that even if they told the public what was going on, the public really couldn't grasp it, organize themselves, and do something about it.
So when you talk about America being the tip of the spear, at least in the eyes of these people, around this time in the 19 teens, do we see that as a result of, the state of the powers in the rest of the world not doing well financially, physically, war-torn, destroyed, and the United States is last man standing? So they say, okay, there's the weapon, or there's the face. And I'll just add this to that. I said in a recent show, collectivism is essentially even progressivism in its modern form, I really see as the greatest evil disguised as the greatest good. Collectivism especially, like, oh, don't be selfish, pitch in, join the team, shoulders to the wheel. But what really is hidden in that is something very, very nefarious. And it seems like the United States served the same purpose in the 20th century because of the heritage and the history, or at least what people learned in the United States and throughout the world about the heritage and the history of the United States. They said, there is the perfect face for this new order, this new agenda for the 20th century.
Well, and it goes even deeper, because we have to remember, since 1920 on, this group that we're talking about had created the American Historical Association as a front group to provide this British, Anglified, American history, this British spin on Americans, America's fight for independence. And so when you get into what you're referring to in the beginning of your question, it goes back into your last episodes, where you're talking about Woodrow Wilson, Colonel House, how Wilson didn't have any credentials, but because Colonel House is advising him, he gets all this stuff done. And you talked about Paris 1919 and redrawing of the map of all these countries around the world. You did a really great job on that. It was fun to listen and re-listen to that. But the additional aspect is House's handler. Colonel House had a handler who lived upstairs from him named Samuel Untermeyer. Now, if you look him up, you'll see he's a pretty famous guy. And Untermeyer is the connection of how America was brought into World War I. So basically, the way World War I worked was that Germany was really well fortified under the Kaiser. They were fighting, they had a battle line with France, and so they were winning the war. And at a certain point, the British were kind of down and out, and France is down and out. And the Germans say, we'll stop the war right now, and everything goes back to pre-war status. At which point, these central bankers go to the British government and say, you guys are going to lose. How about if we bring America into the war and you guys win this war? So there was a whole turning point and different agreements cut. And a week before World War I started, the Cecil Rhodes De Beers Company cut a deal with the German Oppenheimer Diamond Company. So you had a true cartel monopoly formed between two countries, England and Germany, that went to war a week later. So the people behind the scenes, they know that what war is. It's tricking of other people to go fight and move and lose these lives, all that are innocent. And the real people planning it are never setting foot on the battlefield. They're never getting in harm's way because so few people do the research to figure out who's really running the world.
When I talked about this in a similar series about the rise and fall of the Nazis, I described states or countries and flags, all these ideas that's children's toys of how the world really works. And, another metaphor that came to mind was there used to be this show on cable called BattleBots, where these kind of stupid, awkward-looking robots would be put in some confined area, and they would just smack each other until they were destroyed. And, people outside with the controllers would each walk away with some prize money and go have a beer together. So it's interesting as you're telling this story about, the central bankers going to Britain and saying, let's bring in America. When America comes into the war, Germany is rounding up resources to send Lenin back to Russia for the Bolshevik Revolution, which I'm pretty sure was funded by the same group that we're talking about.
That's American International Corporation. Lenin was trained in Switzerland and carried by private train. It would be interesting research to find out whose private train car transported Lenin in at this convenient time when there had already been a small revolution, and then these other people come in and they basically rebrand that revolution, much like what you've seen in Egypt, Libya, what's going on in Syria right now. So there's a long, rich history. In fact, I want to just pull one little artifact here, because this is a recent Foreign Affairs magazine. This is printed by the Council on Foreign Relations. You see Death from Above. They got the drones on here. They're really liking the drone programs. And there's an article in the back about transnationalism that talks about how America is an isolationist country. And so what you see is, this is almost 100 years after the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations. They are still trying to take away American sovereignty and have transnational law that supersedes the Constitution and puts us under the United Nations. So the idea is, even though this has been going on for a long time, there has been a serious resistance in this country because there are few enough individuals who have intellectual self-defense to remind the rest of the people that you can put some questioning in between stimulus and response, and you can escape all this propaganda that we've been inundated with. But at this point, I think that I've overstepped my bounds, and I want to listen to what Kevin has to say, because I think that he would even have more to say on this topic than I would.
Well, no, the point with the American Historical Society, they also did it with the American Political Science Societies in the United States as well. There's a great book called Politics and Progress, The Emergence of an American Political Science by Dennis J. Mahoney, which discusses how Prussian architecture was brought into the United States by influential British individuals. And then there's the Pilgrims and Pioneers book I wanted to share by Sir Harry Brittain. And he is the founder of the Pilgrim Society. And the only reason he wrote this history that I hold in my hand is because Philip Kerr, Lord Lothian of the Milner Rhodes Roundtable Group, suggested that he do so. And this gives the official history of the Pilgrim Society, its connections to the mechanisms of power, how they set up a Court of St. James ambassador from the United States, where they would come there, they would have a Pilgrim Society meeting there, and they would do the same when the British ambassador came to the United States. And then they would also metaphorically claim artifacts of English and British history, and sometimes literally. They actually went and bought George Washington's ancestral home and put their regalia, and they're in control of it as a museum. They also had a little ship that they used as a symbol for their organization. So these bodies, were well thought out on how they could sew a story that would bring about the type of unity they craved. And when I mentioned earlier John Robert Seeley, the English essayist and historian who was the imperialist that Rhodes idealized so much, he argued way back in the late 1800s that using new technology would save Britain from its decline. And when you mentioned earlier, they're latching onto the United States, that's exactly right. They were seeing themselves in a stage of decline. You can look at Arnold Toynbee's famous work, The End of History. And he comes to the United States on behalf of Robert Maynard Hutchins and speaks at the Center for Democratic Institutions out in Arizona, New Mexico. Where they're lamenting over history ending because the United States has sovereignty and it's spinning its own unity based on its own principles, although that had been highly usurped by what they say is Anglo-Saxon Prussianism, where they get the United States involved in these wars, where the historical model would have been to stay out of all foreign entanglements. So that really where they start doing that is in the late 1800s. And there's a book by Porter Sargent called Getting Us into War, as well as War in Education, that is years before Quigley published anything at all. And he's saying the exact same thing. He's saying that this Rhodes Roundtable group had infiltrated the United States. And then I just want to mention one earlier, which would be Charles Grant Miller, who was a reporter at Hearst Publications, who discovered in 1922 that the Rhodes scholarships were being used as a way to usurp American education. You can look towards Plimpton Publishing, who publishes the original documents advertising Rhodes scholarships for William T. Stead. And he runs a textbook company that controls how American history is to be taught going forward. And this is the same exact legacy, George Plimpton, the same legacy that becomes involved with the Teachers College at Columbia, where their educational strategies are completely centered around a global polity and a global community. They're no longer concerned with American issues because that's all been taught out of the schooling.
One, the good point about Plimpton that ties into the trivium is he has a whole archive at Columbia on the classical trivium. That's the form of mind control where it's stimulus response. We teach the trivium method where you use your 5 senses of observation, identify, and organize before you talk. So I also wanted to give you a thumbs up on Porter Sargent. Porter Sargent is a fantastic researcher, and he is a predecessor of Quigley. So most of what Quigley says, I took with a grain of salt until I went out and found primary resources and found many other authors who were just lesser known, who had written about this in decades and even almost a century before. So this idea of the Pilgrim Society that Kevin's talking about, it's an Anglo-American, it's a transatlantic union of rich people. That's really what it is. And Andrew Carnegie plays into this. It started by Rhodes' last will and testament when he dies in 1902. And then you have that going forward. So this other character that Kevin mentioned was William T. Stead. He's the if you get the book, The Last Will and Testament of Cecil John Rhodes, William T. Stead is the publisher of that book. He's the original member of the Rhodes Roundtable. He died on the Titanic, which J.P. Morgan owned. And so now we're getting into the 20th century, around the time of the World War I, and how these groups, kind of drop the deadwood, and they continue on with their own plans of Federal Reserve, Council on Foreign Relations, and that's where really you have magnates like the J.P. Morgan Empire, the Standard Oil Rockefeller Empire, kind of all join forces in the name of transnationalism, collectivism. This is admitted by David Rockefeller on page 405 of his memoirs, where he says people accuse us of doing these things, and he says it's true. So he's observing that Americans don't read yet, but it's out there. So it's these ideas that we're trying to communicate. I mean, Brett is just now kind of wading in through this aspect of history, but it's a single thread that connects through history. That if you learn about the different branches on this tree, then you're going to have a much more contextually full and rich understanding of that's what's going on today. The British are funding Muslim Brotherhood, and that's all done through the Anglo-American establishment all the way back into the 20s and 30s when they set up the Saudi royal family. So today's events, today's news that you're seeing, you can actually understand what's going on, and you can dismiss the arbitrary points being brought out to you by corporate media and start digging into the substantial history that we've laid out, not only in the School Sucks podcast, but in the Peace Revolution podcast and all the other productions that we've made over the years, because that's the focus point. If you can get things in focus to where you can see clearly by using these lenses through communication and critical thinking and history, then you're really working with all the tools that you need to find your way, make a map, and keep on balance. And that's what we're all trying to do as individuals, I think. Right, Brett?
Absolutely. And yeah, you're right. I am just kind of wading into this. I mean, I think I've always been aware of it to a certain extent, but one of the things that's really problematic about this massive topic is, there's multiple ways into it, and it can be very intimidating. I wish we had that guy from RSA Animate with his little dry erase board.
Oh, me too. Yeah,
to
awesome.
keep track of the conversation for us, because when we mention just a certain name or a group or an event, we could, tangent into an hour of conversation right there. And it is very hard to produce a clear narrative for people when you bring in all of these other interests who see this plan in motion and see how appealing it is. I mentioned the carrots for a variety of different individuals to be involved in this. You mentioned a name a couple of times, Lionel Curtis, who was another academic. He was an Oxford professor, and he picks up the torch, I think, after Milner in the development of the Roundtable group, both the inner and the outer circle. And his job is really the establishment, as I understand it anyway, his job is the establishment of these front groups. So in Britain, that's the Royal Institute of International Affairs. in the United States in 1921, thanks to the tireless efforts of House, who we've also mentioned, Colonel Edward Mendell House a bunch of times. It is the Council on Foreign Relations. And this was a plan that Quigley points out was drawn up in Paris, right after World War I. But how does that start to impact the political, academic, and really foreign policy discussions in the United States over the course of the rest of the century?
Well, the way this affects it is that Lionel Curtis is probably singled out by Quigley as the most important person involved in the Rhodes Milner Roundtable group. He even tells Rudy Maxa to, I don't even know if you want to talk about this guy, and that's the Washington Post interview that you can hear from 1974 with Carroll Quigley. Lionel Curtis, you have to really look into the founding of All Souls College and how these individuals went on to establish their long tenures versus what was normal at the time. So you had Lionel Curtis as well as Lord Halifax, who would go on to hold ambassadorships and many, many prominent positions. You had groups of individuals who had a small circle, a small ring of people that had access to power and influence who were following in the exact same legacy. So how this continues in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, and before you have the Hotel Majestic meeting with individuals from the United States and from Great Britain who were also members of the Pilgrim Society, who got together and decided that they needed to have these bodies established on both sides of the Atlantic to control foreign policy. So it's really a power and influence clique that has been in control since the early 1900s. Out in the open. They announced that the Council on Foreign Relations had J.P. Morgan money quite some time ago. So you can see these competing interests, but you have to look at the common threads. And something I didn't want to get away from, to make my earlier point, if I may, was that the use of technology as a way to stop them from decline in order to merge a cultural interest is seen in fruition when at the Pilgrim Society's first meetings, they're able to use the Atlantic Wire because a Pilgrim Society member owns the Atlantic Wire. And they're able to talk back and forth from the English Society as well as the Society in New York at the same time. So they're using these technologies as a way to create an interconnectivity that is light years ahead. So it's a planned obsolescence for the populace and a way to profit off of that planned obsolescence by controlling, the meters that regulate energy and things that we need for our survival today. So it in addition to using technology and using educational technology, I think these things, kind of merge together. And the last point on that would be that All Souls College has a sister school in the United States, and that is the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, where many of the advancement. Exactly, Woodrow Wilson. So Abraham Flexner goes over to All Souls College and spends several years there with Lionel Curtis and with Philip Kerr, who would come around, Lord Halifax, and all of these individuals. And he's the head of Rockefeller money. He's the one that's distributing money throughout the United States. So there's a guy named Tom Jones who in 1940 creates the Pilgrim Trust, which is quote unquote not connected to the Pilgrim Society, but it happens to create this same Institute of Advanced Study where now you have the most powerful groups on either side of the Atlantic, the Cliveden set and the Georgetown set, as well as the Wall Street bankers, in control and at the forefront of the greatest technologies that are not available even yet to the public. And this is what continues to this day.
And, in a moment, we can move into Anthony Sutton and Zbigniew Brzezinski and show you how this all ties into the cybernetics, the smart grid, the smart devices, everything you see today. We'll tell you about the history in a second, but I just wanted to concentrate on Flexner. He said this name, Flexner. There's a book out there called Rockefeller Medicine Men. It shows how the Rockefeller Foundation influenced adversely our education system, but also the medical education system, including the pharmaceutical complex that grew out of it. So the Flexners, there's two brothers, they write a report, it's all Rockefeller money, corrupts our entire healthcare system and our education system in this country. Good name to dig into. Also this idea of them taking technology and hoarding it or keeping it away from the public, using it ahead of other people to have a strategic advantage. J.P. Morgan took over Tesla's work and basically boxed it up and kept it away from the public only after Tesla's main funder, the Astor, I forget which Astor it was, if it was Vincent or his father, but the Waldorf Astoria, is this, hotel in New York. It's a German hotel, German family, the Astor family that had been here for a long time. They died. His financier died on the Titanic with William T. Stead. So when you have J.P. Morgan continuing on, and he dies later that year, but his company moves on. And J.P. Morgan and Co., Standard Oil, all these types of funding come together in the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a Lionel Curtis group. So Lionel Curtis is there at Versailles. He's there for the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He's there for the Council on Foreign Relations, but he's also there in World War II for Clarence Street and these other Rhodes scholars who create a plan called Union Now to merge America and Britain, to unite against communism and to beat the guys in the Cold War. These ideas were circulating, and very famous people in this country supported that plan. And the Rockefellers' rebranding of eugenics for American society under molecular biology. Now, I know that was a lot. I think I actually hit all the points that I was intending to bring up, because it's not so much understanding anything from this episode. It's knowing that these things exist, that there's credibility and substance, and we're giving you the stubs and the keys to do your own research, because really, it wouldn't benefit us if we could just transmit our understanding to you. That's like stimulus response. That's kind of creepy. What we want is to inspire you to do the same things that we had to do to get here, to make this show, to be on air, and to communicate these heavy-duty ideas that you're not going to find given to you at any price in any university or any school on the planet, which is why we do it, because we think it's pretty cool. I'm sorry, Brett, was I overstepping my bounds just talking that much to your audience as well?
No. That's absolutely fine. But we've mentioned these names multiple times, Morgan and Rockefeller. I think everybody in my audience is familiar with those names and knows who J.P. Morgan, the Morgan family, the Rockefeller family, and their interests. But what might not be fully understood is the motives for collusion with what seems to be an ideological group like the Council on Foreign Relations. Like, this is a policy group. This is a think tank, at least as it would be explained to people in the world today. So why are they such great financial allies, Morgan and Rockefeller, of something like the CFR or related groups?
Well, the whole policy of the CFR, when you get into the history, it's to collectivize America. It's to make America a part of the British Empire. It's to control our domestic and our foreign policy making by having many people in CFR throughout our government and all working off the same script, though compartmentalized. So what you're not picking up through Norman Dodd as he's going through the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Ford Foundation, undermining our country through the education system to control the statecraft machinery of this country, the State Department and our foreign and domestic executives. So you see there's a comprehensive plan that's being worked into our culture. It's being integrated into our culture while no one's really looking. They see the Council on Foreign Relations magazine and they're like, oh, what a stately looking magazine. It's very respectable, and you've got Philip Zelikow and John Deutsch, and none of these people, Richard Haas is in charge of it. So Hank Greenberg and Henry Kissinger, these are all respectable politicians, but if you read those books, what they're telling each other ahead of time is, hey, here's what we're going to do. Because I've got a 1998 issue here that clearly talks about catastrophic terrorism and Osama bin Laden, two separate articles. But when I reviewed this with Brett the other day, the term weapons of mass destruction shows up no less than 4 or 5 times in this article. It talks about World Trade Center. It talks about Pearl Harbor. It talks about all the things that the neocons allegedly came up with. Well, they're in this magazine, and you should check it out. It is the November/December 1998 edition of Foreign Affairs. And, John Deutsch and Philip Zelikow. Philip Zelikow, he's the guy who takes care of the 9/11 Executive Commission and writes that report where everyone unanimously agrees on what's true. That's interesting. Reading is fundamental.
After they tried to put in Henry Kissinger first.
Exactly. So they are at the point where they're treating the American public like you're stupid. When you see Rachel Maddow on Comcast's MSNBC and she's a Rhodes Scholar and she's making fun of Alex Jones, maybe you should put 2 and 2 together and be like, who is paying this Rhodes Scholar to say these things, and why can she never address his substantial points? Why does she always have to commit fallacies of attacking the messenger and treating her audience like they're a bunch of idiots? I don't think you're idiots. I know every person is just sitting there with infinite potential, just waiting to learn how to learn anything for themselves. And then everyone becomes autonomous, and that's pretty cool. That's what we're working toward. That's what Hegel was afraid of. He said the individual nature of human beings is to be free. That means government, as it stands today, as a force, fraud, coercion, terrorist mechanism, is obsolete. And all we need are people to pick up their own minds, unlock it, and start using it, because that's what makes you autonomous. And then anarchy is not necessary if we're already autonomous.
So at this point, you know, the book America's Secret Society by Anthony Sutton came to mind. I think we could get into that in a minute. I was looking at my notes, and I'm wondering more about the CFR and what's inside of that. You know, if that was one of these front groups that Curtis set up, or Curtis helped set up in the United States. But just to kind of gather everything together here at this point, we have the CFR, which has today, and probably for some time now, for decades, exercised considerable control over media messages in the United States, to a lesser extent, maybe over academia, and certainly in foreign policy, political discussions. We have these related but separate tax-exempt foundations that infiltrate and gain or reshape academia and lower education. And am I forgetting anything?
Well, I mean, that adds up to them dumbing us down, as Gatto would say, or the deliberate dumbing down of America, as Iserby would say. And so really, it's only because we're not using, you know, we're taught to read, but we're not taught how to think. So let's just ponder that for a second. And then consider that literacy is a form of slavery until you consistently use a method of critical thinking to identify and validate the contents of your mind, right? So they use reading against us for a long time, and they make the books hard to find. But if we organize the books and present them out there and let people know they exist and they start reading them, then we're reversing that whole situation. Then we're undumbing ourselves down. And education is defined in the 1828 Johnson's Dictionary as the unocculting, the unhiding of information, useful information, right? So when we talk about the power structure occulting or hiding information, well, it's in their nature, right? So what's not in our nature is to tolerate it. I don't fault the guy who thinks he's a king. I fault the people around the king who act like that's not some sort of illness, right? So let's just all be a responsible adult and start taking upon ourselves to put stimulus and response separate and put our thinking back in the middle, because that's what gives us our choice. It's that choice of thinking or not to think that gives us our freedom, and that's what makes America's opportunity. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that. They've forgotten how simple it is to make jobs in this country. Jobs are product plus sales equals jobs. So these ideas that Sutton is bringing up through his works, showing how the Bolshevik Revolution, the whole Cold War, everything was Western financed, and that was all a sham. He's saying it's like this history has been here, and he was the first guy to do that work for Stanford, and he got fired for it. But he kept writing, and he kept exposing what he could. He comes across Charlotte Iserby's work on the Skull and Bones, and he publishes a book on that. Now, back to your question about the Council on Foreign Relations, what you'll see is when you take into consideration its membership. So if you were using the personal brain software, you'd start with Council on Foreign Relations, and then you'd start adding people in. As you add people into their membership, look at the jobs and who they've worked with and what's interconnected. Oh, you might see the Gulf of Tonkin. You might see any number of assassinations that have gone on. You'll start to see that the CIA doesn't do its own thinking. It gets its personality, if you will, from the National Security Advisors, which Zelikow was one, and the CFR, right? They're not taking Bilderberg and Trilateral members for that. That's, CFR is United States specific, and it's here to turn our country inside out so that it reflects more likely, a collectivist Soviet Union, and not the America that is supposed to be celebrated on July 4th every year.
Kevin, anything to add?
I can also speak a little bit to what you mentioned on academia, and I think this should put things into perspective for people. I don't want to rehash my whole trivium talk, but when you get to Lionel Curtis's work and what he put forth on the concept of organic union, and these federal union ideas latching on to that of Clarence Strite, who was a Rhodes Scholar who wanted to put forth a program called Union Now that the Roundtable Group latched upon. But those that influenced these guys are responsible for the academic disciplines of international relations and world history. So there is a strategy of discipline creation as a way to bring people into the fold, into a prescriptive way to look about these ideas. So if you go out and you create international relations as a discipline that's going to be taught in schools, and people are able to travel to Geneva, like Alfred Zimmermann, who was the second head of UNESCO, this is how they control the dialogue. And so, you look into who changed the British Commonwealth from the British Empire, and that would be Lionel Curtis and Alfred Zimmermann. And so world history itself, this was Arnold Toynbee's big deal, was that he had created the academic discipline of world history. So in order to be known as a great world historian, you had to be members of the American Historical Society, which was in charge of people that were in favor of the same ideals that Richard spoke to. That would be Andrew Dixon White, somebody that was exposed by Anthony Sutton, who was in charge of the American Historical Society. So with the Council on Foreign Relations, they control not only the academic disciplines that they pontificate upon, they control the outcomes. The Rockefeller Foundation funded the British Committee for the Theory of International Politics that became the dominant ideology within the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And this is, Lionel Curtis and Alan Dulles and John Dulles were all buddies. When John Dulles got appointed to the World Council of Churches, which is a organization that Lionel Curtis was in favor of, he wrote a note to his buddy Lionel Curtis. That's John Dulles, who was the ambassador to Great Britain, and who was in charge of a lot of the scandalous funding of Nazi accounts during World War II. And there's another great book I would mention by the name of Appeasement, A Study in Political Decline from 1933 to 1939, and we'd be getting more into World War II. But it's by A.L. Rouse, who was a student at All Souls at the same time as Lionel Curtis and all of the founders of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which was funded by Alfred Beate and Lord Amory and those that were best friends of Cecil John Rhodes. And so, you see these other individuals try to set up their own unity by creating their own trust. Alfred Beate created his own trust. Amory created his own trust, but neither one were able to stray from simply funding Rhodes' original vision.
That's because Rhodes's vision was so comprehensive that when it's introduced to America through the Pilgrim Society and the CFRs getting together and the Rockefellers and Standard Oil's like, we're going to fund this, as well as the United Nations, which comes later. The Rockefellers donated the land that the United Nations sits on. That's in their own official history. So you also have this idea, the rebranding of eugenics as the molecular vision of life. And if you read the book Molecular Vision of Life by Lily Kay, I think it's published by Oxford, and she was an MIT professor. So this is an example of establishment media that they have put out there that we're just taking the time to read. It clearly goes in through MK Ultra, the Dulleses, and the Dulleses were at Paris 1919, the Versailles Treaty, right? So they're involved for a long time. They're in it for the long haul. They're internationalists. And so whether it's molecular vision of life demonstrating the continuity of eugenics, it started in America and Britain, it was introduced into Nazi Germany, but then it came home to roost, and it's still going on today. All of these different affiliations that we're talking about, these have meaningful connections. We're not just saying these guys went to school together and they shared some textbook in the library. No, what we're saying is they're going through a highly specifically tuned system that creates compartments where they're all reflecting part of what that bigger plan is. So whether it's Stringfellow Barr in his Citizens of the World book, he's a Rhodes Scholar, or Clarence Street in Union Now, this is bringing America together with Britain, or any number of the other names that we've talked about here. Anthony Sutton, he's not only got the great trilogy that talks about how America and Britain funded the Nazis and the Bolsheviks, and America's side was also funded by these same central bankers. But when I think Brett mentioned international relations, the whole idea of international relations and the CFR is a subset of international business and banking, which was started by the Rothschild family when they took over 5 different countries' central banking system and had an encrypted courier system that they used to communicate so that no one else could they created some paper currencies. There's a whole fascinating history. That's not conspiracy theory. That's on the Rothschild Enterprises. It's the Rothschild Family Banking Empire website. So when you get into, they own hundreds of different companies, but when you go to their main site, it lists it in the history. It tells about Waterloo and all, the stock market and everything that you might have thought was a conspiracy theory. If you look at the primary sources, these people are ready and proud to admit it. This is the role they occupy in history, and we've been dumbed down so much to just be like, oh, well, is it even there? well, let's not look for it. And if we look for it and it's there, what do we do about it? Oh, wow, there is some substance to this. We should communicate about this. It is worth our time to organize the information and effectively communicate with each other, because that empowers us. Because I don't know everything that Kevin knows. I certainly don't know everything that Brett knows, but by getting together for, an hour and a half and hashing out some of the things that we are familiar with, we can all grow in the right direction.
Yeah, and just to try and tie things together here, it seems like there's a natural force at work and a more conspiratorial force at work at the same time, and kind of a confluence of the two that moves this forward. The natural force, it's really not natural, I guess, but it's an ideological, a philosophical corruption, essentially.
That natural force, to interrupt you, would be freedom, and the artificial or contrived or irrational force would be the use of conspiracy, force, fraud, and coercion, government by intimidation, which is terrorism against others.
Well, what I'm saying is that it seems like there's a less thought out and carefully planned element that's pushing all of this stuff forward. But then there's also the beneficiaries who are mostly, it seems, financial interests. So there's this confluence of financial and ideological interest, and the ideological interests have this corruption of, an all-powerful state or an all-powerful order is a good thing. And whether we're talking about Rhodes or, right up through the 1940s and somebody like H.G. Wells, this was an idea that as orders failed, and they saw the failings of the old orders, they didn't say, well, is this kind of order a good thing? They said, no, let's a new order, a bigger order built on all of the problems with the previous order. And I also am compelled to revise a statement that I've made numerous times on my show before, that, the three ways that you can really bring about a meaningful moral, philosophical evolution in society is through art and media as one category, education, and science. And my previous statement was, well, geez, the government controls all three. But here we see groups of people brought together for various reasons over the course of a century or more who see themselves as revolutionaries and have covered all their bases, the science, the media, and the arts, and, of course, education. And, if you have friends who can print money, that would also be helpful.
Well, I think the one point is it's not about money for them, because they're printing the money out of thin air. Right. It's about their grandiose egos to see their impression made on the planet and live through history like the pyramids. And so what they're working with is more of, it's off our radar, because as normal people trying to meet our needs every day and encountering the word no, which is a healthy thing, the people that run this place is like everyone says yes to them because they want some of that illusory money. So it's about like bringing it back. It's like our needs are different than the needs of the people who are doing this to us. We should be brought into this world knowing that there are, predators, there are interest-specific kleptoparasites, people who plunder our production, and we should be taught before we ever leave the house and deal with other adults that some adults lie, and here's how to find the truth, because people have to use words to lie, and in there is the truth. You can figure out if it's actually something reflecting reality or not. So it comes back to just learning these things that made America America in the first place. Self-reliance and self-esteem and self-confidence come from knowing your environment and having an ability to learn, not because a Prussian education teacher told you in a school system, right? No one told us to learn how to podcast or how to film things and put this out there. This is a symbol of autonomy that was embedded in America, and they have yet to snuff out fully. So let's rekindle this proverbial flame. And what you were referring to is a philosophic corruption. So there's no ruling class in power. There is a philosophic corruption, a corrupt philosophy, which is being served. It's not human. Many people come through, Brzezinski, all these people are coming through the time, Colonel House, they all serve that same philosophic corruption. They think they're special, but they're not. They're serving something that is anti-human, that's irrational, and that will go down in history as, wow, sorry that those guys spent their lives like that, but it had to be like that for other people to learn how to be free. And I think that's the trend that we're dealing with, not only in this conversation, but every conversation that we've had which led up to this.
Yeah, there's certainly elements of it that have direct control where people were trying to set forth agendas. But you also have to look at the way that technology brings people together on its own. But if you can look within that technological founding and find threads of financing from sources such as we've been discussing, then there is a causality to it. But there is an attempt, and a lot on the internet, where people kind of put it in a cartoonish manner. And they're able to kind of lump it all together and then profit off of the scarcity of somebody who's not going to look into that, you know? So they have definitely succeeded in their goals, as Atlanticism and balance of power strategies dominate the philosophies of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. In Thomas Paine's Common Sense and his other writings, he says that Britain would never be an Atlantic power. Well, Britain has become an Atlantic power through its acting through the United States. They saw themselves on a decline, and they needed to infiltrate their systems of education into the United States in a way to change the American polity. And the way you change the American polity is you make sure they don't remember the history, and you make sure they don't know why these individuals were significant at the time, no matter their current shortcomings. Now, we can look at Lord Percy, who spoke of Jefferson as irrational and insensible for his philosophy of natural rights liberalism. And natural rights liberalism is in direct contradiction to philosophies of collective compulsory schooling. And this is against a unified culture.
All right, Brett, do you want to wrap it up?
I think it's wrapped. I really appreciate both of you guys taking the time to share all of this information with me and ultimately with my audience. I might actually do an introduction show to this, so people can have the context laid out, and then I can offer them this show as a way to fill in all of these little areas that I will introduce that you guys fleshed out in such great detail today. I really appreciate it. And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, for my part, I hope that it comes across that we are speaking with diffidence. We have discovered a great amount, but we're by no means done learning. So the idea is that there's definitely something worth everyone's attention to dig into, to verify on your own, to better understand than Kevin and I do at this current point. We're just letting you know we've kind of surveyed this area, and there's definitely gold or platinum or whatever you want to choose, heavy metal, precious metal, to be mined here. And so, we just enjoy that as people get familiar and joining into either of our communities or going through our podcasts and other productions, that they're getting more substance and they're learning how to communicate. And it's the result of those communications that's going to help us put together the rest of the pieces that we have yet to understand.
Well said.
Yeah, well said. And all of this information is readily available to people. It's easily to be verified. And unfortunately, there have been a lot of voices that try to distract from the actual history that Quigley uncovered that is now self-evident throughout historical documents going back to the early 1900s. So I really appreciate being here.
So in addition to the School Sucks podcast, with which you might be already familiar, there's Peace Revolution, there's the history episode that you might see on my channel, and Tragedy and Hope. So I just wanted to say that, it's a pleasure always working with Brett. Anyone I've ever I know we have a lot of people in common in both of our audiences. And so, we're on the right track. What we do is very complementary and synergistic. And I'm just happy that we got an email last week to say, hey, we're doing an episode like this. Would you like to participate? And I hope for Brett and everyone else involved, it was worth our time.
We got to do this once a month.
Yeah, we should. We could do it once a month. We got plenty to talk about.
Yeah.
It needs to be fleshed out. I like it.
Absolutely.
And with all that being said, if you'd like to know more, visit tragedyandhope.com, where an hour a day keeps ignorance at bay. Also, feel welcome and invited to dip into the Peace Revolution podcast, a curriculum which fortifies this history series, as you need the primary source materials to find your own way through the labyrinth of language obscuring these ideas. And last but not least, you can follow me on Twitter to stay up to date on our productions and useful news links I find along the way. Tragedy and Hope. Dissolve your contradictions. Find your bliss. Until next time, I'm Richard Grove, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in and not dropping out.